Thank you, everyone, and good morning. My apologies, my deepest apologies for not being with you today. I was so looking forward to being at the conference again this year. Some very bad misunderstandings about COVID vaccine documentation requirements. Apparently, there's some new digital certificate that you need. I have that. But it was not available at the time I was checking in for my airplane, and ultimately I missed my flight into Johannesburg and then obviously getting down to Cape Town. Love Cape Town, love being in South Africa, so really unfortunate set of circumstances. But with that, I'm delighted that we have a way through technology to be together today. I'm going to focus my presentation on introducing the demand-driven operating model. This is a presentation provided by the Demand Driven Institute, and so I'm doing it on their behalf today. But I think it's an important time to start looking at how do we expand these demand-driven concepts that DDMRP have brought to the market into a wider area of focus. So we're going to go through this in a bit of detail. This is a longer presentation than we have time for this morning, so I'm going to give you the kind of the meat and potatoes of it, if you will, as a way of getting started. And hopefully it'll help you see that there's a lot more to this demand-driven philosophy than simply DDMRP. And it's really critical that clients bring the production scheduling and execution element of their operations into the picture here. We'll talk about how we do that going forward here. This all fits in within the context of what Carol and Chad refer to as the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. And it's really the application of demand-driven philosophies and concepts across all of the major activities within a manufacturing and distribution company, concentrating on ensuring that we are pacing all of our activity in our DDOM to actual demand. And the DDOM has two major elements: demand-driven MRP for materials management, and then demand-driven capacity scheduling for production scheduling and execution. So when you bring those two together, you're in what we call a demand-driven operating model environment. On the far right side, we know every business is evolving and is going to continue to change as we go through time. And so we are using forecasts and S&OP type planning activities to understand how the picture will evolve as we go forward. The idea then with DDS&OP is that we use that insight of where our business is heading and things that are coming onto the horizon to adapt and reconfigure the model. And obviously we learn through variance analysis of prior performance where we can make improvements. So that cycle is what's known as DDS&OP. We're not going to go into the DDS&OP today. We're going to concentrate on the demand-driven operating model, but the whole schema here is really designed to help us pace our production and materials to what's actually happening in the market, and getting away from the MPS kind of MRP concepts that have been so prevalent over the last 30 to 40 years. So let's get started into DDOM. What are the real conditions that make the DDOM so relevant? I think there's some really important observations here, and these all revolve around this concept of VUCA conditions. Any time, which is pretty much all the time for clients, when we have a significant disparity between our customer tolerance time, in other words, how long will the customer wait to get the materials that they're ordering from you, and the cumulative lead time of all of the activities strung together that are required to produce that product. Anytime we have a significant disparity between those two time ranges, we are in a very, very difficult situation, because what we're going to be relying on, and this is in conventional planning, we're going to be relying on a forecast to help us align the activities and the materials to meet that customer requirement, which we know they're only going to wait a few days for their order once they place it. So we better have started all of those activities in advance to ensure that we have the materials available for the product that they're trying to buy. The longer that horizon, the greater that gap, the more we are, by definition, bringing forecast error into the picture. And this is the chronic problem that we all are familiar with in an MRP kind of a concept. And then there's a second effect of this as well, which the longer that string of events, the more likely that there will be variability that will occur in order execution. So we've got two things working against us. One is a big gap between cumulative lead time and our customer tolerance time, leading to forecast error generation. And then as well, from an execution standpoint, the longer that chain of events with no decoupling, the more delays we're going to experience from the standpoint of variation that occurs in any given process. And so, these are kind of the chronic conditions that we're seeing being exacerbated by the VUCA world that we live in. VUCA is a term you're probably all familiar with: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Really kind of defines the world we've been living in from a supply chain standpoint and in life over the past few years with the COVID pandemic. So we know we've got two major challenges, and the DDOM is really designed to help us do a better job in combating these. And the concepts really relate to, if you're familiar with DDMRP, a lot of the concepts that were introduced there around position, protect, and pull. The idea that we want to pull to actual market demand, and that is facilitated by how we position and protect our model, then using ongoing adaptation to help us get through. Positioning and protecting the specific configuration of the model, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, talking about how and where we are going to apply capacity buffers, time buffers, and stock buffers to gain better control of our operating model. Again, that's the combination of our materials management and our production scheduling and execution. Pulling, remembering that the most accurate demand signal we're going to find is the true orders from the marketplace. So the more we can engage our system in pulling to the actual customer orders, instead of relying on forecasts, remember, we're going to have a longer gap between our cumulative lead time and our customer tolerance time. The more forecast error we're going to have, the more execution error we're going to have. The more we can adopt these pull concepts, the better off we're going to be. And then obviously we need an adaptive kind of feedback loop, because as we do this, we learn more. How much variation we're experiencing, where are there points of exposure, where do we need additional capacity, things like that you'll start to see as we go through the charts a bit deeper here. So the idea is position, protect, that allows us to pull, and then through an adaptation loop, we can gain better control of the system as we go through time. There's 4 critical elements in implementing a DDOM. The first is what's called decoupling points. And if you're familiar with Demand Driven MRP, you know what that means. It means a stock buffer that allows us to break the lead time chain that's involved in that long cumulative lead time that we talked about a few minutes ago. The next concept is one of control points, and we'll talk about what a control point represents and how it helps us gain control of our operating model so that we have better effective management. The third is the concept of buffers. That can be stock buffers, it can be time buffers, and it can be capacity buffers. And we'll talk about how we're going to utilize those to, again, gain further control of our system. And then obviously pull is all about pacing to actual market demand. So let's talk a little bit about what decoupling points are. And we'll talk about the disparity between cumulative lead time and our customer tolerance time. The longer and deeper the bill of material, the more dependency we have on those items, the greater our lead time issue is going to be. And we know that that's going to introduce forecast error into our environment that is going to be difficult to manage. And so if we can find positions within our product structure to create some independence, we're going to have better ability to reduce the forecast error, and obviously by pacing to actual demand, have a cleaner signal to be working from. We know that we've got these delays that can accumulate due to the longer our execution horizons are. So if we can find points of decoupling, we can gain better control here. Anytime we have this long chain of events or deep product structures, we are introducing the greater opportunity for signal distortion and nervousness. Everybody's familiar with the bullwhip effect. They've lived with this, and if we can find ways to create some independence with this and within this environment, we're going to be better off. When we think about this at an aggregate level, and people who are familiar with DDMRP will recognize this is called a bimodal distribution, where because of these oscillations and the nervousness within the system, we end up with too much of the wrong material and not enough at the right. And that's a common problem that we see in every one of our clients around the world as they start their demand-driven MRP journey, is that they've really are fighting this system, finding themselves with, again, too much of the wrong, too little of the right. And then within a supply chain, the more layers you've got, the more you are going to see amplification of the bullwhip effect, either coming from market changes backwards through the system or in variations introduced in the production flow as we go towards the market. So decoupling, and SAPICS has got this in their dictionary. It creates points of independence between supply and use of material. Commonly denotes providing inventory between operations so that fluctuations in the production rate of feeding and consuming elements in the operation have independence from each other. And whenever we can put a stock buffer in between those, we create a point of decoupling. This is kind of like a firewall. It's kind of like bulkheads within a ship. It's kind of like the break walls out in the sea that help make the harbor water calmer. If we can find these decoupling points, we can get more control of our system and reduce the level of variation that impacts their operation. In DDMRP, we talk about stock buffers, replenishment buffers, DDMRP buffers as decoupling points. Because what they do is the assumption behind a DDMRP buffer, and I think this is the most critical piece of the whole methodology, is that by properly configuring a DDMRP buffer, we know the stock will be available. It's designed to be available. So if we have a DDMRP buffer within our product structure, then we have a decoupling point, meaning we don't have to wait for the upstream lead time to feed that position in our planning horizon, which is helping us to collapse that difference between cumulative lead time and customer tolerance time. It's a concept called decoupled lead time in the DDMRP methodology. And if you're not familiar with that, it may take a little bit to get your head around it, but the idea is that if we have the assumption that the stock will be available, we now have the ability to decouple those lead times, also gaining the advantage of decoupling the variation that cascades through that point. Safety doesn't provide that same benefit, quite honestly, and a lot of people think of that as really, it's just a different planning floor, but it doesn't have behaviorally the same kind of an impact that decoupling position will. So if we can find points within our product structures, if we can find points within the layers in our supply chain to decouple, we are going to be in a better position because we are breaking those lead time chains. We're creating independence between those loops, dampening variation, and obviously compressing our lead times. So where are we going to be able to decouple? We want to look strategically within our product structures to find those positions. It's not everywhere because there will be items that have very low rates of usage or very short lead times, so there's really not a lot of material gain on short lead time items from debuffering those. But items like a subassembly here, SAA may be a great example, because if that subassembly has multiple parents, it could be a really beneficial to take all of that lead time and move it into a decoupled position. Oftentimes there are material flow restrictions that may limit where we can do this, but you have to keep these in mind as you go through your DDMRP implementation, looking for those decoupling points. We're going to size the buffers in a manner to protect against variation and to respect other key item attributes like lead time, minimum order quantities, and things like that. And if we do this, again, because they're going to help that protect that concept of constant availability, we are going to gain some really critical advantages. Obviously, the more we can collapse our cumulative lead time by introducing decoupling points, using the decoupled lead time concept of DDMRP, we start to get closer to what our customer tolerance times are. And the more effective we do that, we are pacing to what's really out there in the market in terms of demand, while giving very, very high levels of service. Other considerations may be market potential lead time. Can we gain a competitive advantage if we further collapse our lead times? And it's worth the investment of further stock positions that we want to have. If it also, because we have very limited sales order visibility, the more we need a DDOM type model. External variability, inventory leverage, and flexibility. There's a number of factors. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on these today, but this is a strategic part of the thinking when you implement DDOM to gain control of your system. Let's talk about control points. And now we're starting to move more towards the production scheduling and execution side. What are control points? These are points within, according to SAPICS, the logical product structure for a product family that simplify the planning, scheduling, and control functions. It can include gating operations, points of convergence or divergence, constraints, shipping points. DDI really think that it's more proper to think about it in terms of the routing or activities, right? So it's strategic points in the routing or the activities related to a given assembly are really where we want to implement and gain control through this concept of control points. So there's a contrast here between what a control point is, decoupling, and decoupling points. They kind of work together, but they kind of have a different role to play. Control points are placed at the routing level, where resources and work orders are scheduled and actively managed. The decoupling points create independence. Now, a control point can also be a point of entry into the system. It can be the point of exits. So you're going to see that control points impose and amplify control within the boundary of dependence. So think about the steps within the move between the finished product here, E, and its subassembly ICA, and the elements that go into its purchase component, PPA, and the activities that we're going to conduct against that as we come through. The boundaries are defined by decoupling points in the routing structure. So that's the sequence of activity, and the boundary points start to introduce where we can gain control on our overall system. Entry and exit points, are the boundaries of effective operational control. You can't control what your suppliers are doing. Once it comes into your operation, you do have control of that. Once you've shipped it, you've lost control now. So it's within those windows that you're going to really be using control points to help us manage. The better we can maintain and control those, the more effective we're going to be at managing what's happening within those two ends of the spectrum here. Gaining control on exit and entry helps determine whether delays and or gains generated inside the operating model are going to be transferred out to the market. As many of you may know, a lot of the concepts under the demand-driven operating model are driven off of theory of constraints kind of thinking. The idea of a drum resource is very, very consistently applied within the DDOM. Pacing resources, as they call them now, are determine the total system output. So in a sequence of events in a management process or a production process, the one that has the slowest rate of production is going to determine the pace of operations through that whole process. So these are the pacing resources, and if we don't manage them correctly, we can stand to see some very unfortunate impacts. Because if it is truly the pacing resource, time lost on that resource is time lost to the entire system. So we're going to manage those in a very, very careful way. And when you apply DDOM and you apply demand-driven capacity scheduling, you're going to be looking to find what are the resources that really are going to help us find the best way to pace our activities. This is the tortoise and hare example, where the tortoise in the middle of this process is really going to dictate the pace of activity through the entire system. So think of them as drums, think of them as pace setters. They're all relevant concepts within the demand-driven operating model. And these are also going to influence where we may or may not apply stock buffers, because if there's intermediate assemblies that help create and protect that drum resource, those are going to be considered for implementation in a DDOM. Common points. These are points where activities kind of merge, come together, or diverge. And you can have multiple control, you can create control of multiple paths through a common point. And this may be a point of convergence in many environments. Oftentimes paint lines, quality control, test cells, things like that are places where a number of activities are going to come together. Oftentimes these will also be very good drum category resources or activities within our flow. Another thing to think about, though, is oftentimes people went into this idea, they latched on to the fact that the slowest resource is going to be the one that should be the constraint and will manage our production flow. It's oftentimes better to also focus on those resources in our production flow that have the greatest instability, because in effect, they're going to influence our total system output. And if we don't get better control of those by buffering them correctly, they're going to have an impact on our promise state performance and the operational stability that we're dealing with. Oftentimes, there may be environmental conditions or other process conditions where, like I know many companies doing printed circuit boards have yield issues where they have to send PCBs back through because when they get to test, they fail and do not come within tolerances. Anytime you've got those kind of situations, you really should be thinking about whether they should be considered as a drum resource, because if we don't buffer them correctly and we don't manage them correctly, we are going to feel the impacts as we go through our production flow. Operational buffering. So there's 3 types of buffers, and this is where we start to bring now demand-driven capacity scheduling and DDMRP concepts together. DDMRP introduced the idea of the stock buffer. It's placed at the product structure level. It can be purchased items, intermediates, finished goods. It's going to help dampen variation, and it provides this concept of constant availability. Time buffers are inserted into the routing to help us protect certain activities to ensure that they start and complete on the appropriate scheduled time. If we have lots of upstream variability to deal with in our production process, then that drum resource, we don't want to lose time on it. So we're going to insert time into the routing to ensure that we have the ability to keep that schedule. And capacity buffers, and this is kind of a different concept for a lot of people who have tried to level load their plants. But the idea in DDOM is to introduce flexibility into our model. And really, when you think about it, what DDOM is all about is creating more agility. Because of those VUCA conditions we're facing, the more flexibility we can build in, the more responsive we'll be to the market, the more we can get the benefits of these demand-driven concepts. So in fact, we want other resources to have excess capacity, which is a bit counterintuitive to the finance folks out there who believe that, cost per unit produced is the only measurement that matters. When in fact, if we don't have extra sprint capacity, we're going to be encumbering our overall system output, because variation is going to occur. And if we don't manage variation well, we're not going to be happy with the results we get. Stock buffers all buffers absorb penetration in relation to their type. For stock buffers, it's about the rate of consumption, the units demanded. The time buffers protect us from delays that accumulate in the upstream steps. And capacity buffers help us protect against the variance in load requirement. Because if there is variance in the process flow, we may need sprint capacity to help ensure that we can get back on schedule. I'm going to go very quickly through the DDMRP buffers because I think many people are already familiar with this concept. The concept is red, yellow, green. The yellow zone is the heart of demand coverage. It represents the usage over the lead time. So if I have an item being consumed at 10 per day, and I have a 10-day lead time, I'll have 100 units in the yellow zone. Top of yellow is my reorder point. We all know that we can't rely on that rate of consumption or necessarily the lead time will be achieved. So we put a safety zone underneath it called the red zone in the buffer that protects against that variation. If we size that correctly, proper understanding of its variation and lead time in lead time and rate of consumption, then we'll know we'll have the material available, and that's how we'll gain that decoupling effect. The green zone is going to be based on minimum order quantities, minimum batch sizes, and the like, and that really determines what our average order size and frequency will be. These are tied to key part attributes, the buffer profile assignment, that builds up the buffer zone levels. You can learn a lot more about this in a DDMRP session. But suffice to say, this is working for our clients. We now have 130 enterprises around the world and some very, very big companies that are using our solution who are now also engaging and embarking on their DDOM journey as well. We're going to run out of time. So let's get into time buffers now. This is a critical part of the DDOM. They correspond to the scheduled activity or point in a process. So let's think about our drum resource in the middle of this production flow where we've got a range of activities. This is where we're going to be shipping. We want to pace to the actual promise date we've given our client. So we want to protect ourselves from any variation that could occur through this system. A time buffer protects the timing of the scheduled activity of the flow through the protected point. So it's going to depend on where we put time buffers. We don't need to put time buffers at every step in the routing. We use this selectively, just like we do in stock buffers. Time buffers are going to be deployed where they're going to give us the most ability to protect our operating model. So you can see here, we've put a time buffer in front of the drum resource or our constraint, which is going to set the schedule for the entire operation. We've also inserted a time buffer before shipping, because if this is a make-to-order environment, or we could have a stock buffer here, we want to ensure that we can ship on time. So we give ourselves a bit of time post the drum resource to absorb whatever variation occurs after the drum resource. If we properly protected the drum, its output should be completed on time. There could be additional variation that occurs in the subsequent steps. So if we put a time buffer just before shipping, it helps us ensure that we make our on-time order fill rate. So if we have properly timed or set up our time buffers, what we now have is a queue of work in process waiting for execution on the drum. We want to ensure that this time buffer is set appropriately to cover the variation upstream of that drum resource, but we don't want to excessively do this because then we will end up with too much work in process on the floor. The drum resource is going to be that signaling point because its schedule is going to determine the release schedule for material coming out onto the floor. So if you really get into the details of how we implement demand-driven capacity scheduling, that's the rope aspect of it. What time do I need to start the activity so that the routing steps will be completed by the time we reach the front of the time buffer in front of that drum resource. So think of all the steps upstream here. We want to release the material only when it needs to be able to ensure that it arrives at the time buffer before the drum, because that's there to help protect that drum schedule again. It also provides critically, just the same as DDMRP buffers, prioritization and visibility. And I can't emphasize enough how critical this is from an execution standpoint. We have a concept called a buffer board in the software that allows us to monitor the inbound work orders that are coming towards this drum position. And there's two layers in the buffer board. The upper layer is the yet to be received. So if I'm the kind of the shop floor supervisor, I can monitor the pace of these work orders coming in. If I see that they're into the yellow zone, I'm probably going to go check to see where they are in the upstream processes, because again, I don't want to lose that time on the drum resource. If they come into the red zone, that's a signal for real expediting, or I may have to adjust my schedule on the drum. So not only does the time buffer provide an insulation for the upstream variation, it's also a critically important signaling point to help us ensure that we're focusing on whatever execution expedites and actions we should be taking to ensure we protect that drum schedule. Now let's talk about capacity buffers. And this is the one that I think really kind of gets lost. Everybody knows about kind of constraint buffers and things like that, but capacity buffers are really critical as well because we're going to have variation. It is going to be there. And in fact, I think when you step away and really look at what the demand-driven methods are doing is giving us a better set of tools to deal with the variation that always is going to occur. And so if we can do that better, then we're going to gain more operational control of our environment. So we have to insulate our control points, protect against the accumulated variation. The less variation we pass through, the better, right? We've got these two critical schedule points in our model, and these are going to be protected with time buffers. But what about what happens in the middle here? What if we're late? what else do we need in this environment to be able to fully protect ourselves and give ourselves the most operational capability? In any range of activity, depending on the routing and its run rates at each step in the process, we're going to have different levels of capacity requirement. And you can imagine if this blue bar is the full capacity, then the load against that will not always be equal. In fact, if you try to make it equal, you're going to introduce the challenge of having greater risk for variation impacting your environment. You want, this is going to be your drum resource here, other resources to have excess capacity because they help protect against whatever variation. And that excess capacity is good stuff. Even though finance may tell you we want lower cost per unit produced, so get every resource working actively, it doesn't really work that way for us. And if we don't have some capacity buffers within our environment, we're actually going to be introducing more problems. So we can use capacity buffers in a number of ways. I think of it, the most important thing is that we get this benefit of sprint capacity because we can adjust for whatever variation is occurring. Sometimes we can exploit it tactically in being able to sell capacity that we know we're not going to need. And at times, having the more flexible workforce, so in other words, if we've got a bunch of different machining centers, the more we can cross-train our operators, the more flexibility we're building into our environment, again, to help us be more prepared for those kind of VUCA conditions. So I'm going to go real quickly here because I see I'm running out of time. So when we think about visualizing a capacity buffer, we stack it in this way, where the more we're down below the total capacity of the resource, the better off we are. So think of that as our green zone. If we start to get into this environment, now we're starting to get close to where we may turn that resource into a constraint, right? If we get into that overcapacity environment, then actually that resource now has become the constraint. And anybody who's done a DBR implementation knows you can get what's called a floating constraint, where it's moving around the plant, and it's a bit maddening. So we want to identify those drum resources that we're going to use as our scheduling points, whether it's because it's heavy variation or because it's in fact the slowest. And then we want to use that as a pace setter. Implication there is that the other resources have to have some flexibility. You want them to have a bit more capacity so that they can protect for whatever variation we experience. And this is really kind of that cost-centric versus flow-centric kind of concept that I've been mentioning here. And from a finance standpoint, we want every resource running all the time because we think that's going to reduce our total cost of production, our unit economics. But in reality, those do not work in our favor. That a flow-centric model has excess capacity, allowing us to address the incremental variation that's going to occur in our environment. And so really trying to expose and give you some thought here around changing the thinking around how we set up our operating model. We need these three elements, the stock buffers, the time buffers, and the capacity buffers working in harmony because they're what's really giving us better control and flexibility in our environment. So when you think about a fully configured DDOM, we've got stock buffers here on purchase items coming into the system as well here. We may have stock buffers at the end item level for shipping to customers because now if we've done that, that product should be able to ship on the day it's ordered, right? And that's giving us great flexibility in terms of market potential lead time. If it's make to order environments, we're going to put time buffers in front of those to protect for the entire system of variation that could occur. For non-constraint resources, we want to have sprint capacity. So we want to ensure that they're configured with enough excess capacity to ensure that they do not become a floating bottleneck in our environment. We've placed decoupling points, we've placed control points, we've got operational buffers put in place in all the right positions, and this is really what's going to allow us to pace to actual demand in the market. So if we think about this, and I've got 1 minute left before I want to be able to take some questions. DDMRP order generation says I'm going to take demands due today, demands due in the past, or any future spike. So it's waiting as long as possible before we start activity. This is one of the most critical points I think we can make because The longer we wait, without waiting too long, the more accurate our actions can be, right? Because if we are pacing to the actual demand in the market, we know it's the cleanest signal. So the closer we can wait by building stock buffers, by using our DDOM, the better off we're going to be. That's the driver. Actual demand drives purchase orders and stock transfer orders for materials. We get manufacturing orders with request dates for our products. These then provide signaling loops because we get promise dates back. As well, we get synchronization alerts. So when we implement a DDOM with both the demand-driven capacity scheduling and the DDMRP elements, not only are there, kind of the core benefits that I've talked about in terms of, time buffers and capacity buffers and things like that, but we're improving the signaling within the system because these help us focus our activities. That's one of the other big benefits of the demand-driven philosophy is we don't focus on everything. We focus on the things that matter. And a lot of this really comes from the TOC kind of thinking, where, Goldrat's philosophy was very much find the points of leverage. It's not about working on everything. It's it's about working on the right things. So a lot more we could go into. We don't have time for today, so I'm going to kind of wrap up here. I do want to talk about this, because the more agility we create in our DDOM through proper application of the 3 types of buffers, stock, time, and capacity, the more flexibility we're building into our environment. Then we can pace actual demand in the market. We've become more responsive, more competitive, and we've introduced far more operational stability than we would get otherwise. Once you have that established, then obviously your DDS and OP process is going to help you continually adapt and reconfigure your model to stay as flexible and as resilient as possible. And what could be more important in these challenging times that we've all been working in over the past few years? So with that, I'm going to stop. There's more to this topic. I really encourage you to go to the Demand Driven Institute and learn more about the Demand Driven operating model. We're eager to help out in any way that we can. So why don't I stop there, Ken, and see if there's any questions?
Yeah, we've got time for one question. Anybody got a question? Yes, we have a question at the back here. Hold on.
Hi, thanks for that. That was really interesting. Just in terms of the current environment that we have, so we know that materials and lead times are now starting to extend, specifically with the challenges that we're having. So how do you build long lead time items into the DDMRP?
Boy, that's should have known the question was coming. That is an extremely good question, and it's a very, very challenging one. I think, I honestly believe personally that the companies, your suppliers especially, that are asking for longer lead times are actually introducing more problems for everybody, not only you, but for them. And I am advocating for clients to work aggressively at a collaboration with your suppliers where tell me the rate I can get on a monthly basis. What can you give me so that I don't have to think that I'm going to gain an advantage by now going from a 30-day lead time to a 120-day lead time? Or I've seen companies seeing 360 days quoted. Are you saying you're not going to produce anything for me, Mr. Supplier, for the next 360 days? No, they're just trying to get better visibility is the reality because they're using MRP and they have to wait for all their inbound stuff. In reality, there is some level of capacity they'll be able to provide you. And by gaining a better understanding of that, what is that rate? If we know that that rate of this most critically constrained material is, say, 5,000 units a month, then we can also pace our buffers and size our buffers accordingly to know that if that's our constrained material, if we keep driving that, our planning based on our forecast, guess what's going to happen? We're going to be in a supply constrained environment and our inventory is going to be going up. And how the hell can that happen if we're supply constrained? Well, what's happened is that that material has become like the drum in your environment. And so you really need to understand what are the materials that are the most severely supply constrained? What is the rate that I can get them at? how can I collaborate with that supplier so that I give them appropriate signals so I don't misuse their production capacity? And then how can I use that understanding to better contain the amount of other buying or production I'm doing for materials that have not yet arrived? We could do a whole session on this, and I wish I could right now, but I think you really have to challenge this idea that the lead time that they're asking for is going to gain them or you any advantage. It's far better to focus on what rate can I get reliably from you of this material, and then how can we signal to each other in a proper manner to get better control of that.
Erik.
Sorry for that.
Thanks, Erik. We've run out of time, unfortunately. Actually, we need a bit of a time buffer. And I think maybe when you go to the airport next time, maybe include a bit more time buffer.
For sure. I'm flying to Joburg tonight, so
yeah,
so
make sure you got plenty of time buffer. Thank you, Erik, for getting up in the middle of the night and presenting for us. And if anybody wants to know any more, or you need to know some more information about this, you can come and visit us on the Demand Driven Africa stand, and we'll be able to help you out. So it's tea break. Please don't forget to fill in the Uber app and rate the presentation. And Erik, thank you very much. And I'm going to eat your...
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day. Enjoy the conference.
Okay. Cheers then.
Right,
bye-bye.